Well, I'm pretty bored, so I was scrolling through Reddit and I came across a post few days back that I wanted to talk about. And while scrolling through Reddit right now, I remembered that post, so I thought to make a pretty casual video on it. So the question posted by the user was something like, I hate being focused on at my smaller tech company. Should I join bigger tech? And I know it says it's deleted right now, but if I remember correctly, the OP had elaborated this question by saying something like they hate the constant pressure to perform and they work on a small team which has around 4 to 5 employees, I guess. And they basically feel the constant pressure to perform and drive results every single day because they're tasked to build a pretty big project. So they express that they are kind of the type of person who just wants to be given a task, get them done and go home, and that they don't even care about the credit. They just don't care about anything. They just want to be left alone, get the job done and leave. And the other question they asked was that at a big tech company, he has heard that basically you kind of get lost in the crowd and you often work on really small features on a massive project. And he was wondering if this is true or not. Well, as per my opinion, by smaller tech company, it pretty much means a startup, right? So startups can be pretty hectic. Like from my experience of working in a startup, you have small teams and sometimes you're given multiple roles. You also have to communicate with the sales team, with the design team, with the respective front-end or back-end teams. And being a front-end engineer, you also have to communicate with the back-end engineer. And being a back-end engineer, you will also have to communicate with the front-end engineer. And then there's your manager, and then there's different meetings. There's your product manager as well. There's so many people you have to speak to. And yeah, this can get hectic at times. For me as well, I felt it for a long time and I was also having the same mindset. But then I realized that even if I hate it, I still work here and I chose to do so. So it's my duty as a software engineer. Because if we dial back a little bit, what is a software engineer? A software engineer isn't someone who's just supposed to code and leave, right? You are given that designation based on the fact that you have a sense of logical reasoning. Like it's not a small job. You're expected to know a lot of things that many people don't. That's why you're given to work on a bigger project with a small team because only you being a focus group know how to build it. So you're already expected to have ample amount of information. And if you're working with a small team, then you have to communicate with each other because there's no avoiding it. The smaller the space, the harder it is to avoid it, of course. And the thing is, you work for the company, right? So you have to listen to what the company says in this case. If the other 3 or 4 members in your team are communicating and you're the only one who's not, then you're kind of becoming the reason why things get delayed, which is also not a suitable thing. Because you're working for someone, it's your duty to have to adhere to those rules. And of course, unless it makes sense, and communicating with your team members to build a project makes sense. Even though you don't like it, even though many people don't like it, it still makes sense that this is your duty. You still have to do that. You have to communicate with the respective teams, with the respective design teams, managers, back-end, front-end engineers, CEO as well probably, to get the job done. It's just something you can't avoid. And if you're in this job, then you cannot just consider that coding is my only job. No, being a software engineer, communication or an aspect of communicating with your team members is also a part of your job. A lot of us mistaken that coding is all a software engineer does. Well, not really. Before you even code, you have to have those multiple meetings to decide how this feature is going to be implemented, how this is going to scale, how this is going to look like, because you just don't want to directly get into coding and then realize, oh, I messed up. This is not even required. So I wasted a whole lot of time. So you have to get there, talk to people and decide how things are going to be built. This is kind of a prerequisite. This is kind of a thing that comes with this job. So you can't avoid it at all, because the downside of this is if you communicate less, then a lot of time is going to get wasted somehow later on. And this happens a lot. And at bigger tech companies, it's not always chill as well. If you go to bigger companies which are more finance oriented, and I've heard by some people that the tech sector in the big finance companies are a little bit chill comparatively. But it's not always the case everywhere. If you go to Google, Amazon, I have friends there who have to work even on weekends sometimes. So it's not like it's always chill over there. But if you go to a non-tech company and work in a tech sector within that non-tech company, let's say a finance or a law-based company, then yeah, it could be comparatively chill. Let's go down to the comments. In general case, you have to leave tech companies to get away from this. As long as the company's profit center is application development, there will be a requirement to deliver. Yeah, that's pretty much how most companies would operate. It's just a must, a to-do that comes along with the job. You just can't avoid it. If I go more down, well, if I were to really try dig behind the curtain, this sounds like a mentality issue. You're working a highly skilled, highly coveted job. In an unskilled job, it's reasonable to have your expectation of just pay me to do what you want to do and leave me alone. That's true. If all you were doing was stacking boxes for 8 hours at minimum wage, it absolutely makes sense to take the perspective that you are just a cog in the machine. You come in, you stack for 8 hours, and you go away into the sunset. Can't use that word because I don't know if YouTube might just block me. Well, this comment makes a lot more sense, but for what SWEs get paid, you better believe companies will have an expectation to get a return on their investment. True, if someone is just going through the motions, a manager will sniff that out real quick. If you're at an organization where your manager does not sniff it out, then it's probably a pretty crappy company that has other more stressful problems. Well, yeah, that's true. And like I said, it's also important that the rules you adhere to also make sense. So it's important that the manager is not bad here. The manager isn't manipulative. If all that is true and all he's asking is for people to communicate, then it's not a toxic manager. It makes sense. You have to do that because it's a part of the job. And the quicker you do that, the more it is eventually gonna save your time from getting wasted later on when you realize because you did not communicate, you did all these things which weren't required to be done in the first place. Yeah, this comment makes a lot of sense. And because you're not working a repetitive job like stacking boxes, software engineering is not a repetitive job. It's a job where you have to use your logical reasoning, use your mind, build things which are not there. So if you have signed up for a job like this, there are going to be hurdles. You have to go beyond just doing a repetitive task because software engineer is not always a repetitive task. So if you're doing something that's not minimum wage, not repetitive, has a good amount of pay as compared to the normal average population, then yeah, if a company is paying you to do all that and you're above average and doing something different, then you have to prove why you're above average and different as compared to someone who just stacks boxes for 8 hours every single day. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and there's a whole lot of comments in this thread. Let's go a little more down. So unless and until you're working for someone else, you have to keep these things in mind. It's not entirely in your control until things aren't toxic or manipulative. It's not a pretty big ask for you to communicate and be interrupted by other people, especially when you're working with a team with the same goal in mind and on the same project. So for a long time, new employees or interns or just junior developers, they get into this conception that as soon as they're given a design or any new API to structure, they think that's all we have to do, get the job done, code it out, get the functionality working, and that's it. But no, you have to first go through a bunch of meetings, which requires a bunch of communication before you can actually get to the coding part. And believe me, it is gonna save you a lot of time, because at the end of the day, when you finally go to show your work and you say I've done this, someone somehow is going to point out that this doesn't seem right. Why was this part added? It comes up no matter what, it comes up. And that's when you realize, oh, maybe if we had done a collective meeting beforehand, then we could have assessed all these things beforehand and maybe told the designer to create a redesign of the things that weren't quite necessary based on the developer's perspective, and then finally come to a prototype which was accepted amongst everyone, and then in the end proceed to work on it. So this happens a lot in the tech industry. So another alternative to this could be to maybe find a freelancing job. There are some freelance jobs which do not, ask too much from you. They just give you the work that they need to get done. And if you do it, you just clock in your hours, you get paid, and nobody's going to bother anybody. So yeah, I know some people who work at freelance jobs similar to those. They're not bothered by anybody. They don't even have meetings usually. They just get the work they need to do. They get it done. And then the next week, based on when new work comes along, they are assigned that, or until then, they just work on maintenance related tasks, which also doesn't require too much communication. So either way, there's going to be downsides and upsides, whether you join a smaller tech company or a big company, doesn't matter. But if your sole problem is that you want to be left alone and you don't want to be bothered, you just want to get your work done and go home, then I am afraid on any job where you work in an office, or let's say where you're working on a project together with different people, that mentality is pretty much not going to help you a lot. So I know it can get tough sometimes, but that's how things work. And if you're working for a company, you kind of have to adhere to their principles, especially if it's about communication. You have no choice but to abide by it, because to be honest, if you look at things from a higher point of view, then it's not a pretty big deal. And things like these are more of a personal issue where you are not as acquainted to wanting to talk to other people. You're probably a more introverted kind of person, but since you're working at the company, you have to blend in with the principles of how that company works, and also on the principles of how your team members work. Because at the end of the day, if you keep doing what you want to do specifically, then 4 other people are also waiting for you, and it could waste a lot of their time as well. So if 4 of them are waiting for you and they are being empathetic towards you, it's also your duty to get over this feeling that you are feeling and somehow get the job done by communicating with them as well. It has to work on empathy. So yeah, for those of you watching, comment down your thoughts below about this issue as well. I would love to hear your opinions on this matter as well.